Kael Vorstin woke to the smell of flowers he couldn't name, and the warmth of suns plural on skin that had never before experienced atmospheric radiation from binary stars. The disorientation hit in stages. First the recognition that he wasn't where he'd fallen asleep, then the slower realization that he wasn't anywhere he'd ever been, and finally the creeping awareness that the sky above him contained two bright points of light where there should have been one. He sat up slowly, cataloging sensations the way his training had taught him: ground composition beneath his palms, air quality in his lungs, ambient temperature against exposed skin, sound profile of the surrounding environment. The landscape presented itself as aggressively, almost offensively, unfamiliar. Vegetation in shades of purple and deep green formed a thick forest boundary, approximately 50 meters from where he'd apparently been deposited on a cleared patch of rocky ground. The trees, if they were trees, had bark that spiraled rather than grew vertically, and their canopy spread in geometric patterns that suggested either remarkable evolutionary coincidence or something else entirely. Rock formations jutted from the earth at angles that seemed to violate his understanding of geological processes, their surfaces smooth in places and fractured in others according to no pattern he recognized. Kael stood, checking himself for injuries and finding none. His clothes were intact, standard-issue survey gear designed for durability rather than comfort. His boots were familiar weight on his feet. His hands were his own, unmarked and uncalloused. Everything about his body was exactly as it should have been, except for the small rectangular display now embedded in his left forearm, where no display had existed before. The device sat flush with his skin, integrated so seamlessly that he couldn't find the edges, and it showed a single message in clean, efficient text: trial allowed only stone, human-crafted tools, hunting traps, and a defensive shelter. Below this declaration sat 3 progress indicators, each showing 0 of some unspecified quantity. No context, no explanation of how he'd arrived here or who had brought him. No instructions for what constituted success or what happened afterward. Just constraints and objectives, presented with the casual authority of someone who expected obedience without requiring justification. He said several things aloud that would have gotten him reprimanded in professional settings, then began the practical work of assessment. The twin suns suggested either a binary star system or a planet with an unusual orbital arrangement. The vegetation's coloring indicated different photosynthetic chemistry, possibly adapted to a different light spectrum. The rocks. He walked to the nearest formation and ran his hand across its surface. These were the genuinely interesting part. The stone had a crystalline quality he'd never encountered in Earth geology, with grain structures that caught the light and refracted it in subtle ways. A sound from the forest stopped his geological appreciation mid-thought. Something large moving through undergrowth, or possibly something small moving through large undergrowth. He couldn't tell which. The sound repeated, then faded, and Kael was left with the uncomfortable awareness that he had no idea what shared this planet with him, whether it considered humans food, and whether his presence here was known to anything with teeth. The arm display pulsed gently, drawing his attention back to the message. Stone tools, hunting traps, defensive shelter, allowed only stone, which presumably meant not allowed anything else. He tested this hypothesis by reaching for the metal buckle on his left boot, intending to use it as a makeshift cutting edge. The display delivered a shock to his arm that wasn't quite painful, but was decidedly unpleasant, and left no ambiguity about the rules. Stone only. Everything else was prohibited, and the prohibition was apparently enforced by technology he couldn't remove and didn't understand. Kael laughed, because the alternative was screaming, and screaming seemed like it might attract the attention of whatever made those sounds in the forest. He was a geological surveyor, trained to analyze mineral compositions and rock formations, equipped with exactly the wrong kind of expertise for deliberate survival applications. He knew which stones contained valuable ores and which geological strata indicated oil deposits. He could identify metamorphic grade and explain the tectonic history of mountain ranges. He could absolutely not, with any confidence, manufacture a working stone tool without significantly more trial and error than he'd prefer. But that was apparently the assignment, so he began with what he knew, finding appropriate raw materials. The nearby rock formations were too crystalline for flaking, their grain structure wrong for the kind of controlled fractures he'd need. He expanded his search, moving in careful circles around his starting point, examining every exposed stone surface for the qualities he half remembered from undergraduate anthropology courses he'd barely attended. What he needed was cryptocrystalline stone, flint, chert, obsidian, something with fine grain that would fracture conchoidally rather than along crystal planes. What he found, after 2 hours of searching, was something that looked almost right, but felt subtly wrong when he hefted it. The stone was dark grey, smooth, and when he struck it experimentally with another rock, the flake that separated had the curved interior surface he wanted but fractured at an unexpected angle. Alien geology. Of course, the knapping techniques developed for earthstone wouldn't transfer directly. He'd have to learn the material from scratch, understanding its properties through repeated failure until pattern recognition supplied what theoretical knowledge couldn't. The learning process was humbling in ways that academic challenges had never been. Kael ruined piece after piece of potentially useful stone, each failed attempt teaching him something about striking angle, force application, and the specific fracture characteristics of this planet's geological offerings. His palms blistered from gripping the hammerstone, his fingers split where sharp edges caught them during strikes. Blood mixed with rock dust, and he discovered that this planet's atmosphere stung wounds in ways Earth's didn't, suggesting different bacterial composition or atmospheric chemistry. By the time the twin suns touched the horizon, moving in slightly different arcs, he noted confirming the binary star theory. He had produced 3 objects that could generously be called tools. A hand axe with one functional cutting edge, and one side that looked like it had been chewed by something with geometric teeth. A scraper that was more concept than implementation, but would probably work for processing hides if he ever acquired hides. And a pointed piece that might serve as an awl, or might just be a sharp rock he was too tired to admit was useless. The arm display updated, tools crafted 3/5. So 5 tools were required, and apparently his pathetic examples counted. He felt simultaneously encouraged and insulted. Night fell with the kind of completeness that only happened in places without light pollution, and Kael learned that this planet's darkness was occupied. Things moved in the forest, making sounds that ranged from small rustlings to larger crashing noises that suggested significant mass. He sat with his back against the smoothest rock formation, his 3 tools arranged within reach, and tried to remember whether geological surveyors received any survival training beyond the basic safety protocols. They did not. They received excellent training in sedimentary analysis and structural geology. Survival was someone else's department. He didn't sleep exactly, but he also didn't die, which felt like acceptable performance for a first night. When the twin suns rose again in slightly offset patterns, Kael stretched muscles that had gone rigid with tension and made a decision. Before building traps, he couldn't guarantee would work, or shelter that might collapse on him. He needed to understand what he was working with. The environment had rules, patterns, behaviors that could be observed and learned. Rushing to complete objectives without that foundation would be exactly the kind of elegant disaster he'd spent his career trying to avoid. So he watched. For 3 days, Kael moved through the forest's edge and the cleared areas between rock formations, tracking patterns. He identified game trails by the compressed vegetation and distinctive marking behaviors of creatures he hadn't yet seen. He found water sources, a stream that ran clear and cold from higher elevation, and several natural depressions in rock that collected rainwater. He observed which plants showed signs of being browsed and which remained untouched, making careful note of the distinction. The fauna revealed itself gradually. Small six-legged creatures that resembled a genetic compromise between rabbits and arthropods emerged from burrows in the early morning. Larger herbivores, he counted at least 3 distinct species, moved through the forest in what appeared to be regular patterns, though their physiology was unsettling enough that he tried not to look too closely at the details. And predators, observed only through their leavings, tracks that pressed deep into soft earth, scat that contained bone fragments and fur, territorial markings on trees that suggested both size and frequency. The arm display pulsed occasionally during these observations, as if whoever monitored his progress was growing impatient with his lack of advancement. Kael found this grimly amusing. Whoever had designed this trial apparently expected immediate action, quick completion of objectives, measurable progress according to predetermined timelines. They had probably never spent 6 weeks studying the subtle variations in metamorphic grade across a mountain range, or traced the geological history of an entire region through microscopic analysis of core samples. Patience wasn't a virtue he'd developed by choice. It was the fundamental requirement of his profession. By the 4th day, he'd identified the most promising location for trap placement, a narrow section of game trail between dense vegetation and a rocky outcrop, where the 6-legged rabbit analogues moved regularly between their burrows, and a particular patch of purple flowering plants. He spent most of that day processing fibrous vegetation into cordage, twisting and testing and retwisting until he had approximately 6 meters of material that could hold tension without immediate failure. The snare design was basic, a noose secured to a bent sapling, triggered by a carefully balanced stick arrangement that would release when the target stepped on the trigger platform. Kael had read about these in principle. Implementation proved more complex. The trigger mechanism required precise carving with his crude stone tools, the kind of detail work that exposed every flaw in their construction. He improved one of his cutting edges, then another, learning the stone's properties more thoroughly with each modification. His first snare failed when the cordage broke under the sapling's tension. The second failed when he triggered it himself while testing the mechanism, nearly breaking his own ankle in the process. The third, positioned with greater care and built with improved cordage, he left overnight with the kind of hope that comes from knowing failure is more likely than success, but trying anyway. Morning revealed a small creature in the snare, very dead and very much not struggling. Kael felt several things simultaneously: satisfaction at successful implementation, discomfort at the reality of what survival required, and practical concern about processing a catch whose anatomy he didn't fully understand. He carried the creature back to his base area and spent the next hours learning its internal geography through methodical dissection, using stone-cutting tools that became sharper through use and constant refinement. The meat was edible. He tested this cautiously with small cooked portions, waiting between each taste for adverse reactions that never came. The bones were dense and might be useful for tool applications. The hide was thin but could potentially provide material for cordage or insulation. The sinew was obvious value. Nothing wasted, because waste in this context meant hunger later, and hunger meant decreased capability to complete the remaining objectives. He built 3 more traps over the following week. A deadfall positioned along a larger game trail, using a suspended rock, and another trigger mechanism that required even more precise stonework. A pit trap with sharpened stakes, dug painstakingly with his hand axe and reinforced with fire-hardened wood. And a second snare variant that used a different trigger design positioned near the water source, where multiple species overlapped in their movements. The display updated, traps set 4/3. Apparently he'd exceeded requirements, which felt less like achievement and more like the universe's dry acknowledgement that competence once developed tended towards surplus. The traps didn't all succeed. The deadfall triggered prematurely in a rainstorm, and one of the snares caught nothing but insects for days, but they worked well enough, providing protein at intervals that made the difference between survival and merely not dying. With tools developed and traps functioning, Kael turned his attention to the final objective, defensive shelter. The selection of location mattered more than the construction itself. He needed proximity to water, but not so close that flooding became a concern during heavy rains. He needed sightlines that would reveal approaching threats before they arrived. He needed access to resources, stone for tools, wood for framework, clay for potential weatherproofing, and he needed terrain that offered natural advantages, features he could incorporate rather than overcome. He found his location against a rock face that provided one solid wall and wind protection, positioned on slightly elevated ground with clear approaches from 3 directions and the cliff face securing the 4th. The site required minimal clearing, already open enough for building but close enough to the forest for material access. The shelter design evolved through several iterations before he committed to actual construction. A half dugout would provide insulation and structural stability. Stone walls would offer defense and thermal mass. A peaked roof would shed rain without collecting weight, and a small fire pit with careful smoke management would provide heat without advertising his presence to everything within visual range. Digging the foundation trench with stone tools was an education in exactly how convenient modern equipment had made his previous life. Every scoop of earth required tool strikes to break the soil, manual removal of loosened material, and constant resharpening of edges dulled by contact with rocks and roots. His hands, already Kael used from tool making and trap construction, developed new layers of hardened skin in different locations. His shoulders broadened from repeated overhead strikes. His back developed a kind of permanent ache that suggested structural change was happening at the muscular level. The work took weeks. He felled small trees using his hand axe, processed them into support beams with techniques that improved through repetition, and erected a framework that looked precarious until he'd completed enough of it to reveal the structural logic. The walls rose slowly, each stone selected for fit and placed with consideration for the entire structure's integrity. He mixed clay with water and organic material to create chinking for the gaps, learning the proper consistency through failure and adjustment. The roof was the most technically challenging component, requiring layered construction that would shed water while supporting wind load and occasional impacts from falling debris. He used a combination of wood framework, woven branches, clay surfacing, and finally a top layer of overlapping bark strips that created something resembling crude shingles. The smoke hole required careful positioning to draft properly without letting in excessive rain, and he tested multiple configurations before finding one that worked adequately. The defensive perimeter came last. Sharpened stakes positioned to channel approaches, carefully considered sight lines, and a few simple alarm mechanisms using balanced rocks and cordage that would alert him to movement during the night. Nothing elaborate, nothing that would stop a determined assault, but enough to provide warning and perhaps discouragement to opportunistic predators. By the time he stepped back to assess the completed shelter, Kael had been on this planet for approximately 3 months, judging by the notches he'd carved into a stone pillar to track the twin sun's cycles. The structure before him was ugly by any architectural standard, asymmetrical, rough-finished, and clearly built by someone whose expertise lay elsewhere. But it was weatherproof, defensible, and entirely his creation from materials he'd processed with tools he'd made. The display updated, defensive shelter 1/1, all objectives complete, then nothing changed. No rescue arrival, no new instructions, no explanation of what came next. Kael waited, expecting something, then stopped expecting, and simply continued the routines he'd developed. Wake before the twin suns, check the traps, process any catches, maintain the tools that required constant attention, improve the shelter incrementally with small modifications that accumulated into genuine enhancement. Life settled into patterns that felt less like survival and more like inhabitation. He learned which stone types worked best for different applications, the dark gray for cutting edges, a reddish variant for scraping tools, a third type that held points without shattering. He developed a mental map of resource locations, knowing where to find clay for weatherproofing, which trees provided the best structural wood, where game trails shifted with seasonal variations in plant growth. The processing of trap catches became routine but never thoughtless. He used meat for immediate consumption and smoking for preservation. Bones became awls, needles and reinforcing elements for tools. Sinew provided superior cordage for applications where plant fiber failed. Hides became insulation, storage containers, and weatherproofing material. Nothing wasted, because efficiency in this context was survival, and survival had become something beyond mere continuation of biological processes. He was becoming competent in ways that his previous life had never demanded. Not the competence of expertise applied to familiar problems, but the deeper competence of adaptation to novel constraints, of learning through observation, of building capability from nothing because nothing else was available. The display remained unchanged, all objectives marked complete, offering no feedback beyond its initial acknowledgement. Kael stopped checking it after the first month of completion, then stopped noticing it entirely. The objectives had been arbitrary markers imposed by whoever designed this trial, but the actual work, the learning, the adaptation, the incremental mastery, that existed independent of any external validation. He wondered occasionally about the trial's purpose. Was someone watching, evaluating his performance against criteria he couldn't guess? Was this punishment for something he couldn't remember, or selection for something not yet revealed? The questions felt less important as time passed, crowded out by immediate concerns like the crack developing in his best hand axe that required careful repair, or the adjustment needed in the deadfall trap's trigger mechanism to account for seasonal changes in animal behavior. Months accumulated. Kael tracked time by notches but stopped counting the notches, letting them become texture rather than measure. His body changed, becoming leaner and more efficient, developing the kind of practical strength that came from daily application rather than structured exercise. His hands were unrecognizable, coal-used and scarred in patterns that told the story of every tool he'd made and every material he'd processed. One morning, while crafting a spear point that required particularly delicate flaking to achieve the symmetrical edges he'd learned to produce, Kael realized he'd stopped thinking about rescue. Not in the sense of acceptance or resignation, but in the sense of complete presence in the current moment. The work demanded attention, and attention given fully to one thing couldn't simultaneously fixate on abstract possibilities of different circumstances. The spear point emerged from the stone gradually, each flake removed exposing more of the form that had always existed within the raw material, waiting for someone patient enough to reveal it. He tested the edges with his thumb, sharp enough to draw blood if pressed, which he didn't press because he'd learned that lesson thoroughly, and felt the particular satisfaction that came from work done well within severe constraints. The display activated without warning. The first change in months. New text appeared, trial complete, extraction available. A beacon marker appeared on his internal map, showing a location approximately 5 kilometers distant on elevated terrain. He could leave now, apparently, return to wherever he'd come from, whatever civilization had the technology to transport humans across interstellar distances and embed monitoring devices in their arms without surgery. Kael looked at the spear point in his hands, still rough on one edge where he hadn't finished the work. Leaving it incomplete felt wasteful, a violation of the standards he'd developed through months of making things that mattered because they were all he had. He returned to the careful work of flaking, removing tiny chips of stone with precise strikes, adjusting the edge until it matched his mental template of what the finished tool should be. With the spear point completed, he banked his fire properly, distributing the coals and covering them with ash, so they'd remain viable for restart but wouldn't spread. He checked each trap, resetting those that had triggered and adjusting mechanisms that showed where. He secured his shelter, closing the hide covering over the entrance and ensuring the defensive perimeter remained intact for whatever might investigate during his absence. Then he gathered several items, his best hand axe, the finished spear point, a scraping tool that had taken days to perfect, and a small blade that could serve multiple purposes. He wrapped them carefully in processed hide and secured the bundle to his back, using cordage he'd twisted from plant fibers and reinforced with sinew. The walk to the beacon took most of the day, following terrain that was now familiar, reading the landscape the way he'd learned to read it, which plants indicated water sources, which rock formations offered shelter, where game trails intersected, and what that meant about predator territories. The beacon itself was a simple metal pillar, utterly out of place in the natural landscape, humming with power that suggested technology far beyond his understanding. A display interface activated as he approached, showing the same text, trial complete, extraction available. Confirm. Kael touched the confirmation, still holding his bundle of stone tools in the other hand. Energy enveloped him, and the world shifted in ways that his geological training suggested were impossible, but his current circumstances proved were entirely feasible. He arrived in a white room, clean and empty and silent in ways that felt aggressive after months of natural sound. A door opened, and a figure in neutral clothing entered, carrying a data pad and the expression of someone performing a routine evaluation. "Congratulations on completing the trial," the figure said, consulting the pad. "Your performance has been evaluated. Proficiency rating Master Craftsman. Time to completion within acceptable parameters. Resource utilization, highly efficient. You've qualified for advanced placement in the Colonial Development Program." Kael nodded slowly, still holding his bundle of stone tools, unable to articulate why he couldn't set them down, even though he was now in a place where far superior equipment was presumably available. The tools in his hands represented months of learning, thousands of small failures that accumulated into competence, the transformation of arbitrary constraints into genuine capability. The evaluator noticed his grip on the bundle, made a note on the pad, and smiled slightly. "You can keep those if you want." Most participants leave everything behind, eager to return to modern convenience. The ones who don't, the ones who bring their work with them, those are the ones who actually understood what we were testing. "Which was?" Kael asked. "Whether you could build something from nothing without resenting the limitation, whether patience and observation could replace immediate gratification, whether you'd internalize the mastery or just perform the requirements." The evaluator gestured toward the door. "The colonies need people who remember how things are made, even when easier methods exist. Especially when easier methods exist." Kael looked down at his stone tools, then back at the evaluator. "And if I'd failed? Then you would have been returned home with no memory of this experience and no consequences beyond the time invested." "But you didn't fail. The display registered trial completion months ago. We've been waiting to see how long you'd continue working before checking whether extraction was available." He thought about this, about the months he'd spent improving techniques that were already adequate, refining tools that already functioned, learning things that went beyond mere survival into something approaching genuine understanding. The trial hadn't been about meeting minimum requirements. Any reasonably intelligent person could do that eventually. It had been about what happened after minimum requirements were met, whether competence became its own motivation or remained eternally subordinate to external validation. The evaluator made another note, then stepped aside, indicating the door. "Welcome to colonial development, Kael Vorstin. Try not to lose those tools. You'll probably need them again." Kael walked through the door into whatever came next, one hand still wrapped around stone implements he'd crafted on an alien world under binary suns, unable to abandon the work of his hands even when returning to places where manufactured abundance made such primitive tools technically obsolete. Humanity's greatest strength, he reflected, had never been its technology but its stubborn refusal to forget foundational processes, the patient accumulation of understanding that turned constraints into capabilities and limitations into opportunities for the kind of mastery that couldn't be purchased or inherited. The display in his arm powered down, its final message unread in his distraction: "Proficiency Master Craftsman. Recommendation: Advanced Colonial Placement with emphasis on foundational infrastructure development." He wouldn't have cared either way. The work had been its own reward, and the tools in his hands were proof enough of what he'd learned. Everything else was just commentary on what the patient observation of stone could teach someone willing to learn.